So here we have a copy of our original no-edit file. And in this case, I've grouped a few columns from B through E. I've also added some data in this worksheet. And so you may want to take a moment to go ahead and fill in these words in column H. So we're going to start off looking at the total assets data for these companies. So again, we have some made up companies here and they have a certain level of total assets in column I. And we can see that these are listed in dollar values. And so now we want to look at some of the statistics for these particular values. The first thing I want to look at is the mean for these values. So I'll type in equals mean and then select that range of cells. And here you see we have an error message for that cell. And the reason we get an error message is because there's no function called mean. So if we're going to look for the mean, we're actually just going to look for an average. So we have to use the average function. And when we do that, we find a value of about 7.1 billion for the average of total assets for this particular set of companies. Now we can find our median. And our median is going to be the middle value, or the value that's right at the 50th percentile. If there's an even number of values, then it takes the two middle values, adds them up, and divides by 2. So here we see that our median is a little bit less than our mean. Our mode is going to be the value that occurs most often. And in this case, we're going to get an NA for a value because here there are no repeating values. All the values are unique, so all of them have an occurrence of 1, so Excel is unable to identify the one that occurs most often. If I were to change one of the values here, if I were to take the value from the Zulu company and copy it to the Yankee company, we'll see then that the mode is going to be equal to that value. Again, the mode is going to be the value that occurs the most. In this case, it occurs twice within this set of data. Our minimum is going to be the statistical minimum of the group. Our maximum is going to be the maximum value. And so we're going to use the max function here. For our minimum, we used equals min. For mode, we used equal mode. For median, equal median. So in this case, it looks like the smallest value for our total assets is 329 million. And the largest value is almost 14.7 billion. Our standard deviation is going to look at the distance from the observations relative to the average. A larger standard deviation would imply that our values are more spread out across some range. A smaller standard deviation would imply that they're more condensed or more centered around a certain range. Excel has several ways to calculate standard deviation, and we'll look at both the population and the sample, and then also the default standard deviation calculation. We see here that our stdev.p is going to calculate the standard deviation based on the entire population. This would assume that we have every observation in this population. In this example, it would assume that every company is accounted for, which is not going to be the case. But if for some reason we did have the entire population, we could use this function in Excel to calculate its standard deviation. If we look at the standard deviation of the sample, it's going to give us a slightly different value. So here we see that our standard deviation is slightly higher. And the reason it's slightly higher is because we have a smaller denominator in our calculation. In our population standard deviation formula, our denominator would divide by the number of data points in the population. And in our sample, it's going to divide by n-1 observations that we have in the sample of that population. So the denominator is going to be smaller and it's going to drive up our standard deviation. The default for Excel is going to use the sample. It assumes that we don't have the entire population or every data point in a particular group. And here we see that. In this case, for this data, you've noticed that I've moved around quite a bit in the spreadsheet. I have been using the control and control shift functions in order to do that, accompanied by our arrows. But there may be a better way to do this since I keep selecting the same range, and so what I'm going to do is name the range for total assets. Here we use the Formula tab on our ribbon. I use Name Manager, and I'm going to name this Total Assets. So now we have this name range, and we're going to look at this other function where we can count the number of observations. And it's simply going to count the number of cells in a range that contain numbers. So here we see that there are 26 observations, and that makes sense because we have company names of A through Z. Our sum function is going to add all numbers up, and in this case, we're going to use the range of total assets to do that. So here when we add up the entire values that we have for total assets, we have $184 billion in total assets. We probably have an idea of what value this is going to give us. That's going to give us the same value as our mean, and average will do the same as well. So we could use those functions as well. Here we're going to look at the small and large functions. And small is going to give us the kth smallest value in a data set. For example, if we wanted to find the smallest one, we would use a value of 1. If we wanted to find the 5th smallest number, we would use a value of 5. And here we see the arguments for it. Where we're going to look at an array, and in this case, we're going to look at our range of total assets. And just so we can see what's going on, I'm going to choose a value of k in the cell above. So here, just you notice we get an error message, and that's because we haven't selected a kth value. So if I were to use a 1 for k and the small function, that's going to give us the smallest value in that array. In other words, it's going to give us the minimum value in that array. If we go back up to the top, we see our minimum, and we notice that that's the same number. If I wanted the second smallest number in this array, I would choose 2. And so we can adjust that k in order to choose what values we want. The large function is similar. It's going to return the kth largest value in a data set. So in this case, if we were to look at the combination of our small and large functions with a k value of 1, the small function would give us our minimum, and the large function would give us our maximum. Here you see that the large and the maximum values are the same number. A value of 3 would imply that we have the third smallest number and the third largest number. In other words, for the large function, there are 2 values that are greater than 13.6 billion. And so in this case, if we wanted to use these functions together, for example, if you were calculating some average of your grade, but it dropped a few of the smallest values that you had, for example, if we were willing to drop a homework or a quiz score, and if we were to drop 2, what you could do is take the sum of all your scores, subtract out the minimum of that range and the second smallest of that range, and so the minimum would get rid of the smallest, and the small value using the value of 2 would get rid of the second smallest, and then divide by our count minus the number of things that we need to drop. So in our count function, we would simply use count minus the value of our k. So in that, with our count value, we would just use count the total number of observations that you had or the total number of homework or quiz scores, and then subtract out the value for k. If we dropped more than 2, you'd have to make an adjustment to that formula, but it could still be done. So again, these functions are going to provide some statistical information about our data. One additional function that we can use in Excel is our rank function. And our rank function is going to return the rank of a number in a list of numbers. Later editions of Excel have updated this function to include rank average, where we're going to return the rank of a number in a list of numbers. And if more than one value has the same rank, the average rank is returned. And so in this case, I'm going to use the simple rank function. And here we'll have to remember that we have grouped data, so let me ungroup that first. Here we can use the range of total assets, and you probably saw what happened. If I were to select all of that data, it would automatically update to that named range. And so that's going to provide the rank of that list. And in this case, it's going to look like this value for total assets of 10 billion is going to be the 9th largest value. Again, you'll remember that we're ranking total assets. And so here we see our rank in the number 1 position of 14.694 billion. We'll see our maximum is 14.694 billion. If we look at the first largest or the kth largest value in that range, it's also 14.694 billion. Here, because I know there are 26 values, I happen to know that this is last in the ranking. We see a value of 329 million. You'll notice here that that's our minimum. And here that it's our smallest value. And so it's possible we could use a combination of these functions in order to work with statistical information in Excel. And to be sure, if you wanted to replicate this spreadsheet, you could see the statistical formulas and functions here.